Welcome to our introduction to plating. Although food preparation is very much a science, food presentation is an art. Good plate presentation results from careful attention to the colors, shapes, textures, and arrangements of the food. Great plate presentation requires experience and style. Food plating is the mountaintop. The final step in food preparation is to justify the hours of hard work spent cooking the food by presenting and serving it properly. The following components are what we're going to look at in today's presentation: keeping it hot or cold, cutting food, molding food, choosing a plate, classic plating, contemporary plating, a plan, lines, arc, circles, and triangles, and finally, arrangement. Don't mix the messages. When we're serving any kind of dish, it's important that our plate is the same temperature as the dish that we're serving. It's not a good idea to serve a hot piping soup in an ice cold bowl, because what's going to happen is that soup is going to lose all of the heat because the heat is going to go into that cold bowl. So remember, hot food needs to go on hot plates. Cold dishes need to be served on cold plates. It's good to remember, if you're ever doing a tasting menu and you're doing a palate cleanser like a sorbet, make sure those little sorbet glasses are frozen. Again, if your sorbet glass is at room temperature or even at fridge temperature, that sorbet will start melting much quicker than if the glass is frozen. Molding foods. So what am I talking about here? This is quite often used as a very classic technique, but I am seeing it pop up on Instagram feeds and other magazines today. Some foods, particularly grains or vegetables that can be bound by sauces, can be molded into attractive, hard-edged shapes by using metal rings, cutters, or timbals. These molded forms create height and keep the plate neat and clean. That's the real benefit here of molded dishes. Classically, you'll see rice dishes often put into a mold because rice has a tendency to sort of spread all over the plate, and that can leave the plate looking a little bit messy, and we want to avoid that. It's really important that we keep plates neat and clean unless our dish is specifically designed to have some of those chaotic kind of elements. But molded dishes will help eliminate any sort of sloppiness on the plate. Choosing the plate is one of my favorite things to do. Outside of working here at the Culinary, I also do a little bit of consulting as well, and I work with restaurateurs or aspiring restaurateurs to create a menu and an ambiance and a vibe for their restaurant. And this can often come from the plates that we choose. Something as simple as that can really have a lasting impact on the success of a restaurant. A lot of restaurants today are looking at their plateware not only for obviously putting the food on it, but how does it translate into photographs? As we live in a very consuming social media state, it's very important that all of our pictures look as delicious as the food actually is. So properly cooked and carefully cut, appropriately molded foods should not be just thrown onto a plate. You need to choose and position the foods carefully to achieve a plate presentation with balance, harmony, and absolute composition. And as I said, choosing that plate really reflects the style of the food that you're serving. Restaurant china is designed to withstand the rigors of repeated use, and it's available in lots of different colors, shapes, and sizes. Frequently, specific plates will be used for specific dishes, such as a tulip sundae glass for an ice cream dish. When I was in culinary school, there was only really one color of plate that counted or mattered, and that was white. And white and cream are by far the most common colors for restaurant china, because most foods, pretty much anything you can think of, always looks good on a neutral background. However, that's not always a hard and fast rule. We can look at contemporary designs and contemporary plates, which can be a little less conventional, and we want to look at contrast. So in the pictures you see here, We've got a really nice dark blue background. And then you can see we've got a bright egg, sunny side up egg on top, providing really nice contrast on that avocado toast. And in the center photograph, we have, again, a nice brunch item, and you have contrasting colors. You have that navy, but then you also have that bright yellow, and then garnished with those beautifully pink and crimson berries. You can see how contrast and that dark plate actually creates depth into the dish. So while neutral colors are the most common and will definitely outlast any trends, um, there is some benefits to maybe including some different colored plates or patterns in your um, Chinaware. We can't talk about plating without talking about the classics. Classical French cuisine is, of course, why we're here, and it's given us the foundation and the basis from which we can continue to grow, learn, and evolve our industry. As you can see in these photos, I've chosen a couple of classics. You can see on the top right-hand corner, we've got salmon Kalubiak. And then also in the center photo, I really love this dish. It's sole meunière. It's very simple, but these are very classically plated dishes. Quite often the classics rely on very intricate, time-consuming knife skills or sauce making or dishes that will have sauces that don't hold over time and that don't store well. These are part of the compositions that really do make the standards such classics. Remember in knife skills on the first week, we worked on our knife skills like tournée and fluting. You'll see those types of plating, and we talk about that when we cut vegetables in those ways. It really will change the way that our dish is plated. So you could do a tournée carrot, but in a contemporary approach, we might do a carrot fluid gel. So those are our two components that, while it's both made from carrot, we can apply it in two different standards. And another component, we talk about classical French plating, quite often there is a strong emphasis on sauce and symmetry and using the clock. And we're going to talk about using the clock a little bit later on in this presentation, but I want you to see these, look at these photos, and what I love about them is while they're classic, they're still quite beautiful. And in my mind, I can see that Sole Meunière, for example, in a Bon Appetit cooking video, and it would not be dated. It would actually be quite modern. Just like we're talking about classical plating styles and techniques, it's also important to take a look at the contemporary. And that's one of the fun things about this course. We focus on the classics because it allows us to have a vantage point to know where we were and what shaped our cuisine, because then it allows us to see the possibilities of where we can go. And here in this slide, we have some beautiful examples of the evolution of plating. And we see here what we would call contemporary styles. And it is a creative style that defines your brand, and plating becomes so important. There's some chefs whose plating styles can be so distinctive that just by looking at a photo, you might not know exactly who it is, but you could say, ah, that looks like so-and-so's plating. And that's really important when we discuss branding. It's important that you find a style that really defines what your brand is. And again, when we're working in industry, when you're on your OJT or you're working under other chefs, again, your plating will be reflecting their style. But in time, those techniques and that training that you're getting along the way will help define your own unique brand. All good plate designs start with a plan. You need to start drawing, and if you have your notebook, like I always encourage you to have by your side, whenever you get some ideas or you're watching some videos or you're working with some ingredients, draw out what your plate is going to look like. There's nothing tacky about that. It's a very, very traditional technique, and we've been doing it for centuries. So Whether you're plating a fish dish or veal with lemon or your own contemporary dish, draw it out. You can use colors, and don't worry if you're not very creative or artistically inclined, like myself, I'm not. You can just use basic circles, X's, triangles, swirls, waves, anything that can denote what an item can be. You don't have to draw a fish as artistically as you see on the picture on the left-hand side, but what you can do is play with your space. And again, a space on a plate is very important. You have negative space, and negative space is anywhere on a plate that food isn't. And how we use that negative space can create a composition that's really beautiful to the eye. And this is where our technical skill as cooks becomes elevated into craft as chefs, because we take those raw ingredients and we use them as a type of tool for design. So now that we have a little bit of an understanding, a basic introduction to negative space and plating, so we've talked about how we can mold dishes or even decide how do we pick the type of plate we're going to use. We're going to now get into the teeth of plating, and we're going to look at lines, arcs, circles, and triangles. So what am I talking about here when I'm saying lines and triangles? I mean, these sound like things we did in elementary school. And fundamentally, it's true. That's exactly what we're basing this on. When we plate things, we're using our eyes and our basic understanding of geometry and space to create a plate that's beautiful to the eye. So if you think about it, simple geometric shapes are the skeleton of plate design. It's the basis upon which the flesh is added. So as we continue forward in this presentation, we're going to look at images which follow and how all plate presentations can be defined by simple geometric shapes, lines, arcs, circles, and triangles. Being able to see the underlying patterns or seeing that skeleton of a layout makes it easier to visualize the end result. And you're able then to play with variations of the design before you ever put food on the plate. I always like to start my plates by thinking of the lines, the arcs, and other patterns that may work, often using my hands to draw an imaginary design on an empty plate. And sometimes I've even used crumpled up paper towel or little pieces of foil or parchment to represent different components on a plate. And really, we are playing with our food, and we can use the materials in our kitchen sometimes to help us with that. So the first line that we're going to talk about is a very simple one, and it's our single line. And what this does, it takes advantage of the negative or the white space. So in the images you see here, we have one line of view where food is on the plate. I love this striking dish on the right with the black and white. Very simple, but it's quite a striking, it leaves a lasting impression. So all of the plating is done in a single line here, and what this type of plating does, it allows us to take advantage of the white space on the plate. And after a single line, we're going to go to two lines. And you can see in the images here, we have two lines of plating as opposed to the single line we saw in the previous slide. And the two lines can be used in a variety of ways to create these spectacular presentations. And the lines don't have to be directly vertical. They could start one on the top left-hand side of the plate and the other on the bottom right-hand, moving vertically towards the center. And these dishes also show us really clear, clean lines. There's a lot of, again, negative or white space still on the plate, and it creates a lot of impact. So these are more minimal style presentations, but that doesn't mean it's not complex. And typically there are two parallel lines when we talk about two-line plating, but they can also cross to form an X. Next on the cavalcade of line presentation, we're going to look at horizontal lines. I absolutely love horizontal lines. They look so lively and very visually interesting, and it's a perspective that really gives the most complete view of what is being presented. And you can see here in this dish, we're using asparagus to really hit home horizontal lines because the lines are very clearly defined. Razor clams are also very nicely served in this manner because, again, razor clams are long and straight. You can use other items, of course, to do horizontal line presentation, but asparagus and anything that is long, stocky, rhubarb works really well in horizontal line presentation. You can make a custard tart with braised rhubarb, but the rhubarb will stay in long stalks and again baked into that custard tart in horizontal lines. And you really get a sense of the composition of the product, the ingredients that you're working with in a very fundamental sort of way. I just love the horizontal line presentation. It can be quite striking, and you're making the most out of, not necessarily a large amount of ingredients. So this can be very creative. Think about what you can do with carrots of different colors in a horizontal line presentation. Things can get really interesting with this style. Here we have 3 vertical lines, and these lines, it's important that they are aligned, that they're parallel, and they can go north to south, and that is what we're talking about here. We're talking about vertical. In the last drawing we saw, or the last plating, we saw horizontal. These are vertical. This is especially great if we're dealing with any type of trio dish. So you could be working with something like lobster, for example. You could do a crudo, and it was one, butter poached, and maybe grilled or some other type of presentation. So when we're talking about trio, typically we're serving an item in 3 different ways, or it could be 3 different cuts, for example. This dish, again, visually dynamic. It doesn't have to be for just a main course. I think it works really well for main courses, but it can certainly be used for appetizers or smaller plates. Now we're moving on to arcs. So arcs are a very important design element that we can introduce into our plate design. And quite often, one of the biggest roles that arcs can take in our plating is it allows us to bring softness into a dish. If we're serving something that can be very blocky or very imposing, perhaps like a pave potato, for example, it'll add softness and fluidity to the dish. And you can see here in both of the plating designs, the top one, we're using a monochromatic design. So that means we're using all green in our plating. So it's all green dish, all green ingredients. And you can see how it's very flowing, and it seems to really have no beginning point or end point in the dish because the greens just washed into each other, and it creates a very peaceful, soft looking dish. And the bottom dish, you can see we have a single line item, and it can be, it would look a little lonely, I think, without the arcs. Typically in the kitchen, we don't necessarily say, oh, we need to put some arcs onto that plate. Oftentimes we might call it a sweep or a swoosh. The swoosh is always pretty, and we can use a variety of ingredients. You can use different oils, gels, aiolis, anything that can hold its shape or allow you to do that sweep or swoosh is a perfect component to go into a dish. Now we're getting towards the end here, and one of the final dishes I'm going to show you is all about chaos and unorganized structure. Now, this is very hard to say it only follows any one of those elements we talked about, lines or arcs or triangles or anything like that. This dish plays by its own rules and therefore becomes one of the most complex types of plating. And we want to look here at both of these plating diagrams or these dishes, and you can still see that there's an important focus on both the negative or white space and then the actual food ingredients. And you can see there's something very beautiful. You keep looking at it and you find something new to look at and uncover and explore. And you can see that if the broccoli on the left-hand food photo was maybe, even just a little bit more to the left, it might look off center or it might just look sloppy or messy. And again, the right-hand dish it's not necessarily following any of the rules, but it is so structured that every item and every ingredient on that plate has a purpose. And really, if it were put anywhere else, it might just look like mess on a plate. These are techniques that are very advanced and will take time to master. So have fun and play, but again, I would suggest starting with using basic lines and arcs, or even the triangle, which we're going to look at next. This is the basic foundation, the clock or the triangle. And what we're talking about here is this is something you would plate at home. So if there's any home cooking, diner food, this is quite often where the plating techniques come from. This is using 10, 2, and 6. So the 10 and 2 on the clock is where you're going to see the veg and the starch. So again, we're thinking of the plate as a clock. So 10 and 2 is our veg and our starch. And in the 6 o'clock position is where we're going to see the protein. And if you look at TV dinners, they're set up that same way as well. A lot of times the vegetable or the sides will be on the top at 10 and 2, and the protein will be the main item closest to the diner. And there's nothing wrong with this plating, and I think it's really important actually that we get a basic understanding of how to plate starting here. And you can really play and grow, and this can also be very contemporary. You can even do a 10 and 6 and 2 micro plate design. So at 10 and 2, you can even have the whole clock at one at 10 o'clock, one at 2 o'clock, and one at 6 o'clock. And you can really create a very striking contemporary interpretation of the clock or the triangle. This is one of my favorites, the centered circle, quite often also known as center of plate or COP. And COP plating is something that was very popular in the early 2000s and in the 90s. And you can see here, these are some contemporary items where we're looking at design elements like the curled or rolled up carrots, pickled mustard seeds on the left-hand side I'm looking at. And you can see really nice glazed dish on the right side as well. COP makes its focus right in the center of the plate, and everything is piled in there. So it's very important that everything has a place, that it's not crowded, but at the same time, everything is compact. And this type of plating was quite out of fashion for the last few years, but I have been seeing it come back into fashion, actually in the last, few weeks or so. So you know what? Everything that's old becomes new again. So it's always important to know all of these styles to create, again, your own distinct style of plating. Off-center. Off-center plating looks absolutely gorgeous in photographs. They can really look quite artistic, I think. When we look at the plate, and we use that almost as a picture frame, if you will, you can see there's some real focus on both negative space or space where our food is, and then, where there is no food, and then where there is food. And these dishes are unique because when we put something on the plate that is just off center, what it does, it creates visual tension and interest in our brain, because our brain and our eyes are so used to wanting things to be centered and perfect. When we see things that are slightly off-centered, it activates our brains, and I think that's part of why this plating works so well. And both of these dishes are, they look minimalist, but again, each component and ingredient on that plate has a very important purpose. There's no gimmicks on this dish, on these dishes. They're very thought out. So off center works really well. Okay, so we've looked at a number of different ways we can plate using lines, arcs, circles, and triangles. And ultimately, what we are trying to achieve on a plate is balance. A well-designed plate will have a sense of balance, and it doesn't necessarily mean symmetry. A beautiful presentation, which appears to be chaotic, can actually have balance and a hidden structure, whereas a chaotic mess on the plate is just that. It's a mess. It lacks balance, it lacks structure, but balance means that you look at a plate and it makes sense. You understand it. You may even think, whoa, that's really nice. But a plate that's confusing to the eye or is distracting because there is no focal point or too many focal points are lacking balance. The art of plate presentation can be very simple or minimal, or it can be highly complex and very involved. And that all depends, again, on the personal and unique style that you will be developing. And after we look at balance, we need to go into a focal point. And what am I talking about when I say focal point? And what it is, it's the focal point of the dish. It's the spot where your eye goes to first, the item which draws your attention. Be aware of the way your eye moves around the dish. What does it notice first? Where does it go to next? What is the last thing your eyes go to? Know what your focal point of the dish is and make sure that the focal point is also the item on the dish which you want to highlight. Techniques which create focal point include color, placement, elevation, and color. Bright or contrasting color draws the eye. Elevation draws the eye, and where you place something on the plate either accentuates it or hides it. Use any or all of these to create the spot you want your focal point to be. When you look at this photo of this beef tartare, what do you feel is the focal point of the dish? What is the first thing you notice here? What is the second thing that you notice? And what about the third? Does elevation play a role in the plating of this dish? Now that's a lot of information we looked at about plating. Something that sounds so simple at the outset can really have a lot of interesting elements for us to think about. And what's important is that no matter what it is that we're plating, that we use a sense of respect for our diners and that our plating is very thoughtful. We can use a variety of effects. Often the most elegant plates are those with some of the most simple design. Thoughtful presentation improves the appeal and appearance of any food as well as a completed plate. But the important thing to know is that there's nothing that plating can do about poor quality, under-seasoned, or poorly prepared food. I think it's important to consider each element on your plate and ask yourself, what purpose does this element serve on the plate? If it doesn't serve a purpose, get rid of it. And you're going to make some mistakes plating. Everyone does. I still make mistakes and I will continue to do so. That's part of the process of learning. And sometimes some of the best things that we discover about our personal brand and our style and our plating comes from those little mistakes that we make. That shows that we're learning. So take some time and play and see what you can do with your simple ingredients. And remember, playing with your food is always a fun thing to do.